the USGA and R&A proposing a model local rule that gives competition organizers the option to require use of golf balls that are tested under modified launch conditions to address the impacts of hitting distance in golf. The model local rule is intended for use only in elite competitions and, if adopted, will have no impact on recreational golf. So with that, hello and welcome into our Golf Channel studios. I'm George Savaricas alongside Golf Week columnist Eamon Lynch, and this is a 2-hour edition of Golf Today. Eamon, we have so much to get to, and there'll be a lot of ripple effects felt around the golf world. Let's get to more of the details in this proposal so the viewer at home is up to speed. This is the distance proposal. The USGA and R&A proposed model local rule requiring use of golf balls tested under modified launch conditions to address hitting distance. Model local rule only intended for use in elite competitions. We're going to have to get that specific definition coming up, which would be available starting in 2026. Conforming golf balls under the model local rule must not exceed overall distance standard limit 317 yards at 127 mile per hour club head speed. So what is the definition here for this model local rule? A modification of a rule or an additional rule a committee adopts for a competition, that's the definition of model local rule, has same status as a rule of golf for that competition, covers situation or issues that arise often enough to justify having a model form. This all part of the Distance Insights project between the USGA and R&A that was launched back in May of 2018 to study the impact of hitting distance in golf. February 2020. Remember, the Distance Insights report was released. It detailed hitting distance trends in golf. A year later, February 2021, specific areas of interest, proposed equipment rules, changes that were issued regarding distance. Then the spring of last year, March of 22, updated areas of interest released on hitting distance in golf. And now the model local rule proposed for golf balls in elite competitions. Time now to welcome in our guest to the show. That's USGA CEO Mike Wan, along with R&A Chief Executive Martin Slumbers. Guys, this question to both of you. Martin, would like to start with you. How did you settle on the golf ball as the area of emphasis?
So, I mean, it's quite interesting looking at your slide that you're just putting there, how many years we've been working on this topic. But you'll recall back in March of 22, we published an area of interest that said we were interested in two topics. One was a ball for the whole game that had a different overall distance standard. And secondly was a model local rule on the driver, which would have reduced forgiveness across the face of the driver. Over the last 6 months, we've had a lot of comment, a lot of collaboration, a lot of discussion, and a lot of work between Mike's and my teams and Mike and I together. We heard three pieces of feedback. One was, please do not do anything to affect the recreational game. The golf's doing well, and we don't want to undermine this. Secondly, we heard that an MLR on the driver would impact multiple clubs, and you could result in the unintended consequences of a 3-wood or a 5-wood being having higher performance than a driver. And thirdly, we heard too much change proposed, guys. It's too complex. And so we listened to that very carefully. We considered it in the context of all the data analysis we had. We considered it in the context of we are focused on the future of the game and where the game is going and the integrity. And we wanted to make sure that we were targeted and we were proportionate in our proposal. And so as we went through that, we decided that we were going to focus on the ball and we were going to focus on elite amateur golf, so that there is no impact on the general recreational game. And this is all about elite golf.
Mike, let me address a question to you about these testing parameters that you've introduced. The average club head speed on the PGA Tour is right around 114 miles an hour. The testing speed you're going to use is 127 miles an hour, which presumably looks toward what you believe the trends are going. How did you arrive at that number of 127 miles an hour club head speed for testing?
Yeah, thanks, Eamon. You know, this goes back a lot farther than today's announcement. You know, we started this in 76 and then in 86, and back then we used 109, which represented at the time what we thought were the club head speeds being represented at the highest level and the longest hitters of the game. In 2002 and 2004, we updated that test from 109 mile an hour club head speed to 120, which at the time represented the top 1% of hitting speed. So we've never tried to set the test at where the average is. We've tried to assess where the longest hitting of the game is. And today, the longest hitters in the game are generating 127 mile an hour club head speed. And if you just watch the last few years, not to mention the last few decades, it's pretty safe to say 127 will be reached by even more by the time we're talking about this implementation if adopted in 2026. So every time we've done one of these tests, whether it was 76, 86, 2002, 2004, and every time we announce one of those changes, we announce that we'll continue to relook at this test to make sure that our test represents and replicates the highest hitters of the game. So doing a test right now at 120 miles an hour when a significant amount of club head speed being generated on individual drives at elite levels, and people want to make this about PGA Tour or just the European Tour. We're talking about the highest levels of the game at all different levels. So 127 represents the speeds that we're seeing generated at those levels, Eamon. So we would actually make sure that the ball is addressing that. If we were to say 120, 123, by the time we get to 120, by the time we get to 2026, we'd already be talking about 125. So it's aligned with what we've done historically and consistently tries to, when we reset these, address the highest level of the game.
Mike, with the health of the game right now, the boom that we've seen in golf post-COVID, why is now the time to enact this type of change?
Yeah, you're right, George. I mean, we feel the same way, which is the game is healthy, it's strong. The recreational game is at a level we've probably never seen before. And so when we, to Martin's point, this is a long, deliberate, and really transparent process. And you know me, George, long and patient probably isn't my strong suit. But this process has really forced us to keep telling people where we are every step of the way. And let's sit back and listen for a while. And this is the same is true of today. This is a notice and comment. Today we notify, and over the next four or 5 months we listen to comments. But what I would tell you is one of the comments that we heard, and Martin referenced it, is please don't touch the recreational game if you can. It's really an exciting time, and we don't see recreational golf challenging or obsoleting venues in the long run. And so we tried to incorporate that in this change, where this doesn't affect the retail business for recreational players today. It doesn't affect the clubs and balls that are in your garage or in your trunk today. It enables the recreational game to continue as currently planned. At the same time, and George, I will tell you this, I think a lot of people want to have this argument about the game today. Martin and I's job is to make sure that we look at the game today and those trends and what they'll look like over the next 20 or 30 years. Very few people, and I know there are some, but very few people will argue based on what you've seen in the last 40 years that distance is going to continue to increase over the next 10, 20, and 40 years. I mean, there's virtually no data that would make you comfortably say that, although I've heard some sort of argue that. So given what's going on with speed training and youth and athleticism, we see increases continuing. And the real question is 20, 25, 30 years from now, can the game sustain that kind of continued incremental growth? So that's why we haven't been in a rush to make this change. And that's why this change is really more about addressing the future and not about correcting anything today.
Martin, the modified local rule appears specifically aimed at elite men's golf. No one's suggesting that women hit the ball too far right now, even at the elite level of the game. What happens if the elite tours on which those competitions are held choose not to adopt the rule? Does that in any way diminish the governing bodies? Or how does that work politically if there is not the support among the tours that it's clearly aimed at?
I think the great advantage of the model local rule is that we're creating options for the game. We're creating choices. And during the development of this process, there's been a lot of collaboration right across the game that Mike and I have done with our colleagues. And we will continue to do so to have this debate. I think when you look at where the model local rule will be applied, I do think that it will come back into the elite amateur sport because, as Mike and I are trying to make very clear, we're really focused on the future. And when you look at the younger players coming through, the speed training that's going on, the more athleticism, the greater use of excellent technology, we're seeing that increase in speed moving up and will come into the pro ranks in the future. So, I look long term. Ideally, we would like to see the model local rule being applied generically, but I'm taking a long-term view over this, and right down into the depths of the top amateur game and through to the pro game. And from our point of view, it is clear that the Open and our top amateur events, we will be implementing it. So there will be a line in the sand will be put in there for us anyway.
Martin, part of the beauty of the game is that you can try and qualify for the Open or the US Open, and you can have the same equipment that you use at your club and then try and play on the game's biggest stage. Would you say this model local rule in certain respects is a euphemism for bifurcation, which is something that the golf world has been reticent to adopt previously?
This is my 8th year in this role, and I hadn't heard of that word when I came into this role. And I think it is a word that has been talked about quite a lot, and I can understand why as we try to keep the game. But really, I think we're moving, as the game is developing, particularly in the men's game, particularly in the elite game, when the quality of play is so distinct from the regular amateur, that really we've moved past the point where bifurcation is in any danger of undermining the recreational game. And I think what we're really focusing on in my own thinking is ensuring that we keep the integrity of the sport, the balance of skills at the top end, but also keep that balance of skills and the integrity in the recreational game, and ensuring that we keep it thriving.
Mike, you mentioned how long
George,
this process has been going on, all the way back to the 1970s through the 80s. Sorry, Mike, did you wish to add to that?
Yeah, thanks, Eamon, for the opportunity. I just wanted to add on to Martin's comments, which is I've heard this argument a lot in the last hour, I guess, since we've released. And I think you know this, Eamon, but maybe the viewers don't. I mean, there's something in the neighborhood of 80 model local rules available today to competitions, 10 of which are club-related. Some are as recent as 46-inch driver or green reading materials. Some of them a little bit more, whether it's yardage, distance devices. These are all rules that have been an opportunity for competitions to do things that are slightly different than the regular recreational game. So if people are concerned that model local rules are bifurcation, unfortunately, we passed that bridge 30, 40 years ago. And some of those, by the way, model local rules aren't driven by the R&A and the USGA bringing those to. Some of those have tours and other competitions that have come to us and said, help us manage green reading materials, or help us manage, one ball versus multiple ball rules. So model local rules, if for those elite amateurs that have played in one of our elite amateur events or have had the luck to make it to an Open or US Open, they've experienced model local rules and they've existed for a long time.
Earlier, Mike, you'd mentioned how long this process has been going on. There have been certain benchmarks all the way back to the 1970s. If this model local rule has been introduced now, it would imply that there's a sense that there's a pressing need to act between the governing bodies. Is that not a tacit admission that your organisations have failed to this point in their responsibilities to do something before now?
Fair critique, Eamon. I mean, if that's what you want the headline to be, that we should have done this 10 years ago, I think Martin and I will both take that as a fair critique. I've said this many times, which is I'm open to any dialogue with anyone who loves this game about what the right choice is going forward. The only dialogue I haven't been real comfortable with is the person who looks me in the face and says, distance isn't getting any longer than it is today, because there's virtually no historical perspective, or they haven't been to a junior speed training clinic or been to a junior amateur to kind of see what's happening. So do we have this exactly right? I don't know. A year ago, I thought we did, and we've made quite a bit of changes based on that feedback. I know we'll probably make some adaptations based on this next feedback period, but the only choice that I think is patently wrong at this stage is no choice, because I don't think anybody could argue with the fact that this game is going to be 20 or 30 yards longer in the next 20 or 25 years. And if that's the case, we're just handing the sustainability of this game to the next generation and the 30,000 golf courses around the world and telling them to just figure it out. And that's a responsibility that neither Martin and I are willing to shirk. And so there may be more learning on how we can actually do this in the exact right way. But we will definitely make sure that we don't leave the game for the next generation more challenged than the generation that's playing it today.
Mike, could you elaborate on these sustainability issues? If you say 20 to 30 year purview that you're looking at, how much additional real estate are we looking at with distance gains? Like, are you able to break it down from a monetary standpoint?
Well, listen, if you think about how long we've been working on this distance project, and again, I mean, I walked in maybe in the middle of it, but since 2018, these are long, deliberate, very transparent processes by design. So if we want to have real change in 2028, we start working on 2018. So we can't, somebody just said, well, why not just wait and see how much longer is in 10 years? Well, at that point, it's too late to kind of make significant change. I think with the kind of change we're talking about in this notice and comment, we'd probably see a 14 or so yard difference for the average elite male competition. And based on the way distance is going, that means 15 years from now, we're going to be right back where we are today. And we're okay with that. We're not trying to shut down distance forever. We're not trying to shut down athleticism. We want longer golfers to be longer than shorter golfers and be able to chase that advantage, just as we have in the past, and that's kind of where we are today. But we know that if 302 is the average elite male competition driver, becomes 322, becomes 342, we're asking golf courses to change. We're asking golf courses to find more property. We're asking golf courses to have more water, more nutrients, in a time in which, not in all parts of the country, but in a lot of parts of the world, just being bigger and having more cost and having that cost just get passed back to the golfer is a tough ask in a lot of parts of the world, especially parts of the world where water and nutrients aren't as plentiful as some of the others. So I think it would be irresponsible for us to see what we see coming and simply say, well, we'll leave it for the next generation. And to Eamon's point, if you want to critique us that maybe we should have done something in 10, 11, or 12, so be it. And we'll take that critique, but we won't take that critique and decide to do the same thing in 2023.
Martin, obviously the sustainability issues as it relates to the environment and resources is a huge thing looking forward. Do you believe that skill has also been diminished in the game as a result of distance, that elite golfers are being asked to showcase less than they might have been in previous generations?
I think skill is something that we've thought about a lot through this process. And I think you have to step through from the recreational game through to the elite game in answering that, Eamon. And I think if you look at the recreational game, the advent of improved technology, which we've seen for hundreds of years, but it's accelerated in the last 20, 30, 40 years, I think it's been a fantastic thing for the game. It's turned what is a difficult game into a slightly less difficult game. But when I look at that, I also think about the balance between skill and technology. And as you move up through that continuum, I argue that skill can be perhaps replaced by technology. And when you look at the integrity, when we talk about the integrity of the game, and we talk about the integrity of competition, it is that balance of skills from driving to mid-irons, to short irons, to chipping, to putting, that is about the integrity of game, and that's about history. And our job is to reflect history in a modern way. And being able to get that balance right, I think is really important to the long-term integrity. And I absolutely believe that this notice and comment will actually help us maintain that balance in skill and technology in the coming 20 years.
Martin, when you look at all the different stakeholders in the game of golf, obviously you have the governing bodies that have pushed this forward. If you talk with golf fans, I think it would be an extremely small minority that says the ball goes too far when they're enjoying looking at or watching a championship event. You also have equipment manufacturers, professionals, golf course operators, and architects. It seems like a very delicate balance that you have to navigate to push this forward without hampering the growth of the game going forward.
Yeah, I think one of the wonderful things about our sport is there is so many different constituents and partners and stakeholders in it. But Mike and I have talked about this a fair amount, and our responsibility as governing bodies is as custodians of the sport and the future of the sport. And governance isn't easy because we have to think out longer term. And we also have to have views on where the game is going, but not everybody's going to agree with. And, I think if we end up with a situation here where half the people don't agree with us and half don't think we've done enough, we've done the right, we're in the right position as governing bodies. And we have to think forward, and we have to have that integrity of long-term integrity of the game. And it's challenging, and it's up to us to sell our case and make sure that we're preserving this fantastic game for future generations. The one thing I do think that is really important out of all of this, and is that doing nothing is not responsible and not acceptable. We have to do something, and this is what we think is the best next step. And we will go through the next 6 months and listen and think as well as we go through that period.
Mike, as you mentioned earlier.
Hey, George, let me
Sorry,
sorry,
ahead,
I mean, you know me, I'm always ready to add more to it. But I think I just want to make sure that you know that neither Martin and I woke up this morning and said, wow, this is going to be a fun day, and this is what we live for. We know this is hard. We don't enjoy being the one that pushes for making sure the future is in the right plot, in the right spot. And I certainly knew when I took this job a couple of years ago that governance is a challenging role. But I also, having been somebody who's worked at a manufacturer, somebody who's worked at a tour, and now worked at a governing body, I also understand the difference between sort of who I work for, whether it's membership or shareholders, consumers, et cetera. And the one thing that is true, and spending this last couple of years with Martin and his team and my team, is we really view that we work for the game, and that despite the difficulty and the challenges and sometimes the significant pushback, making sure that the game for my kids, or more importantly, my kids' kids, is healthier than the game that I'm enjoying right now, or at least as healthy, is something somebody's got to think about. And I can tell you, when I was sitting on those other roles, I just couldn't spend the time with that. My members or my shareholders were focused on today and tomorrow and this quarter results. And so it's an interesting spot to now come full circle and be in this position to really say that, as difficult as it is, as much pushback as you're going to get, your job is to make sure that when you see things that could be problematic for the game long term. And to your point, George, I can't wait for the average fan to say, yeah, you're right, we're 30 yards longer today than we were 30 years ago. And we'll probably be 30 yards longer in 30 years, but that's okay. That's their job, is to enjoy the telecast and enjoy the game today. And we're going to do all we can to make sure we don't interrupt that. And at the same time, make sure that nonchalantness to 30 more yards and golf courses will just figure it out doesn't become a problem for the game.
Mike, to Martin's point about finding this balance between skill and technology and making sure that technology doesn't diminish the skill requirements asked, wouldn't that be something that would be tackled by addressing golf clubs and the forgiveness of golf clubs, which you've said in the statement is, for now, off the table? Is that something that's permanently off the table, or is that something you think potentially you look at down the road again?
As we pointed out a year ago, Eamon, we were looking at golf clubs that have a smaller sweet spot and a little less rebound off the face. As we got into, to move that significantly enough to have a real difference at the elite level, the club became so small that you would actually have to do fairway woods, hybrids, and it became sort of not sustainable to think that with the top players could be serviced at that level, that a local PGA or USGA and R&A person could implement that at a local level, and maybe that was even cost prohibitive for the individual player. So for today, we took that off the table. The concept is still very much interesting to us, and even as we said in our notice and comment, even the way face rebound, if you will, starts to sometimes creep over time on current golf clubs is a concern and something we're going to take a deeper look at. So I wouldn't say we're done looking at golf clubs, but I think in the current phase, we said what we talked about in the area of interest a year ago is not something we're pursuing at this moment. We're trying in this process to make sure that both the manufacturers and our stakeholders know exactly where we are when we're there, and they have a chance to chime in on that exact situation. So it's a unique process that we're kind of sharing exactly where we are as we go. And when we move away from something, we feel a responsibility to share that, and that's what we did.
Martin, you mentioned the intent of the R&A to introduce this model local rule at a future Open Championship. How much do you drill down into that championship when you apply this? Does it go all the way down to local qualifying, where guys have to use that golf ball? And, you know, people who've qualified for it on other tours clearly won't have been using, or might not have been using, that golf ball to achieve the status that's getting them into the Open. How far does it go in terms of where the expectation is that this equipment would be played for the Open Championship?
I think it's a great question, which I don't have all the answers for at the moment, and it's certainly part of the work that we've now got to do over the next 6 months, and actually probably a little bit longer. But you know, I think that it is certainly not just elite tour golf and majors that I believe should be part of this model local rule. It does need to come down more into the elite amateur sport, and maybe even to some of the club sport. But that is an option that we've now given the game. And it's an option that I think over the years to come will be an option that more may choose to adopt. But the detail in terms of how the qualifying is, work in progress. and certainly a lot of thinking still needs to be done.
Martin, I know golf fans will think of, okay, well, back in the day, there was a different ball that was used for the Open than what we saw over here with the U.S. Open and the PGA Tour. Any precedents to what we saw historically and how that was handled with what we're going to see going forward?
Well, I mean, I'm old enough to remember playing the smaller ball. And I know quite a few of the players in the Open in those days would flip between smaller balls and the larger ball, the 1.68 American ball. But we introduced, going back to the point about model local rules. There was a model local rule put back in the 60s around moving to the one ball, and that was to manage that small ball, larger ball dilemma that was going on. And I think that we've always had to manage that, and we always will manage that as we go forward.
Mike, if this model local rule is adopted, for instance, for USGA championships several years down the road, how difficult do you anticipate that would be to actually police once you move out of a US Open and suddenly you're talking about, for instance, the United States Amateur?
I think of all the different options we've looked at, Eamon, including all the different approaches we could take, this is by far the simplest. You're talking about a golf ball. So from a cost perspective, doable for the athlete. You're talking about something that we can handle from a conforming list and sharing with the tournament operators. So of all the different ways we could approach this, and at the same time, to Martin's original point, leave the recreational game alone, I can think of no option so far that we've reviewed that would be easier to implement than the one on the table. Now, you're all kind of thinking about in today's world, but 3 years from now and having different golf balls available. I mean, Martin talked about I'm old enough to remember playing a balata ball, knowing that I was 10 yards shorter than some of my other friends, but I played it because I wanted the performance levels, but more importantly, I was going to play in events. So we've seen different variations of this, but yeah, I think this is very executable at a local level. And quite frankly, this doesn't work if this is just about 40 tour stops or 40, Corn Ferry stops or a few major stops. This has got to go into qualifying sites and state and local amateurs. I mean, long term, if we're really going to make sure that we can protect courses from having to continue to spend tens of millions of dollars every 10 years to keep up with the game, that we have to make sure this is about the high level of the game, not just one aspect of high level of the game.
Mike Martin, I know there are a lot of people who would like some of your time today to discuss the new proposed model local rule. We really appreciate you being so generous here on Golf Today.
Thanks for your help, guys.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having us.
Moving right along here on Golf Today. This statement from Acushnet. They said one of golf's unifying appeals is that everyone in the game plays by the same set of rules, can play the same courses and with the same equipment. Golfers can watch professionals and compare themselves to the world's best, aspiring to hit the same shots. The USGA and R&A have announced a notice and comment to manufacturers proposing a potential rule change to golf ball testing that results in a model local rule that provides for reduced distance golf balls intended for professional and elite amateur competitions and a different set of rules for all other play. This bifurcation would divide golf between elite and recreational play, add confusion, and break the linkage that is part of the game's enduring fabric.